Elden Ring is one of the most anticipated titles to come out in quite some time, and especially on PC, where players have been enamored with From Software games ever since Dark Souls was ported in 2012. Though that port was of disastrous quality by PC standards, From Software has indeed been increasing the quality of their games on PC, starting with Dark Souls 2 and last with Sekiro. These versions were honestly the best versions of the game you could play. Does Elden Ring continue that trend? Unfortunately, no. The upward trajectory of From Software games on PC has now flatlined with Elden Ring, as the PC version of this game at launch is in not a great state. In today's video, I will outline the issues I encountered in Elden Ring's PC version, present a comparison to the PlayStation 5 version and derive some settings that it uses, as well as presenting some optimized settings for those who are looking for that kind of thing. But before we get into all of it, let's first stop at the graphical settings menu. If you've seen a From Software settings menu since Dark Souls 2, this will all be very familiar to you. There are a good amount of settings here with an okay amount of scaling, but issues start cropping up as soon as you start venturing more than a quick glance. For one, you will see that there's barely any description of what the settings do, as there's no preview screenshot or text. This will make casual tweaking by the average user less effective. Secondly, there's no setting control for Vsync. Vsync is on by default. Now, this would normally not be a big deal, but the reason it is there is because the game is purely limited to 60 FPS maximum, even if you were to force off Vsync with your control panel. To me, this is a large issue. Ever since Dark Souls 1, the PC audience has been begging From Software to embrace arbitrary frame rates, including those above 60 FPS. This is brought up vocally with every single new From Software title released, yet still, in 2022, nearly 12 years after I acquired my first high refresh rate flat panel monitor, Elden Ring still does not support above 60 FPS out the gate. This is not a great start, so let's move over to those individual settings themselves and see how they compare next to the PlayStation 5 version. I'm comparing to PlayStation 5 in its performance mode versus the game fully maxed out at 4K on PC. There were just a couple of areas that stood out as being visually different or superior on PC. Shadows, for example, in performance mode on PlayStation 5 are of a very low fidelity and are not very visually appealing for a game releasing in 2022. They have very obvious large edges in them, and when the sun is moving, which is always, the shadows jiggle incessantly. This also happens with camera movements very close to the player character like you can see here, and the shadows on the floor are extremely flickery. When doing the side-by-sides, we can see that PS5 performance mode is the same as PC's high. I find this discouraging given their quality. Medium I would barely consider a shadow map, and maximum is really the only visual setting with coherent quality. This is also the setting that PlayStation 5's quality mode uses. Motion blur was also one thing that I noticed that was missing in PlayStation 5's performance mode, where the various settings on PC reduce the size of motion blur on screen as you see here, making it less obvious the lower the setting is. Effects was another area where I saw the PC version rising slightly above. PS5 in both modes here is using the high setting. This setting changes the quality of the bloom as well as the distance at which lights render. So here you can see PlayStation 5 is missing this light at a distance, where PC's maximum setting has it on. This setting is strange to me, as in Sekiro, the light distance was controlled by the lighting setting. Here the lighting setting does something completely different, and it controls in a binary fashion whether or not a light can cast a shadow, although there are very rarely lights in Elden Ring that actually do cast shadows. And just like Sekiro, I also could not find any differences for what the shading setting does or what the auto-detect best rendering settings does. So there are some settings in Elden Ring which are not really obvious with their differences, or there are also some which have very minute differences. Take ambient occlusion. On medium it is obviously different, static and dark in a way not visible on high, maximum, or on PlayStation 5. Yet the differences between PlayStation 5 high or maximum is practically minuscule. I just noticed that PlayStation 5 is running at a lower resolution in this scene, which is why the SSAO looks kind of different. A similar thing happens with the grass option. Here PS5, PC's high and maximum are quite a great deal different than PC's medium, which is much more like the last gen console versions. Yet the difference between high, maximum, and PS5, therefore, are practically invisible. Perhaps there's a difference in texture resolution on the grass at a distance, but I don't really think it's a big deal. Volumetric quality seems to have the same amount of aliased edges in the volumetric fog as PC's maximum. and when I looked at the game up close in this beginning scene, PS5 in performance mode seems to resolve the same level of detail in the shadow in the fog as maximum, whereas high and medium to my eye look noticeably less detailed and blockier. Global illumination quality is also a match for the highest setting on PC, where here, for example, you can see global illumination increases the level of occlusion at a distance for larger objects and scene details, probably as a result of a denser probe grid. All in all, PlayStation 5 settings look like this. Shadow quality and motion blur are the areas of reduced quality in the performance mode. Yet in quality mode or elsewhere, most of the settings look to be the maximum quality, or at least high, and there's almost no difference between the maximum and high quality visible on PC, thus making exact matches hard to delineate. Now, usually at this point in a video, I would describe these settings like I did above and how they run on a GPU like the RTX 2060 and how you would get optimal performance in this game. But with Elden Ring, I honestly don't think this is very important currently at the moment, as there's no good way to get optimal performance in the typical sense with this game. You see, Elden Ring on PC has a stuttering issue. Elden Ring on PC is the first From Software game on PC that ships with DX12, and DX12 is enabled by default, and I have not found a way to change the API used. As I've discussed on Digital Foundry before, DX12 takes away the responsibility for much of the game's memory management threading away from the driver. The game developer then has the primary responsibility to make the game run well. And unfortunately here, I'm seeing a lot of issues I see in Vulkan or DX12 games when they're not completely fully baked. The stuttering issues that occur in Elden Ring will occur on any PC hardware. No configuration out there will be immune to them. You will notice these stutters right when you get into the game. The first time you will move your character, there's a large stutter. The first time you will thrust your sword, there is a large stutter. The first time you generate any new particle effect for the first time, there will be a large stutter. The first time you see a new enemy type, there will be a large stutter, and so on and so forth. And these can be very long and visually intrusive. This looks like shader compilation stutter to me, which means every single time a new effect of sorts will come on screen, the game will try to compile it in real time as the game is rendering. This is a massive issue, and any new thing you see will cause a stutter. Technically, the game will become less stuttery over time as you revisit areas you've already been to, but that is not at all a good situation. Furthermore, every single time the game gets updated, the game gets reinstalled, or a person updates their driver, the stuttering will crop up just like you loaded the game up the first time. On top of this type of stuttering, there are also stutters that appear to be tied to game loading. Like here, I walk up the staircase into the game's intro and I see a massive stutter drop. This happens no matter how many times I load this scene up. Or here in the fields, I see the exact same thing. These can be very long like you're seeing here, but they can also be short one-off frames when you walk forward through the open world as I'm showing here. There's no real consistency to it. Sometimes they can happen rather often, like 4 to 5 times within a span of 15 seconds every few meters you walk, but sometimes you don't get them at all for hundreds of meters of traversal. The last stutters I noticed were those that occurred on camera cuts and cutscenes. I find this strange as these are exclusive to the PC version and I could not find them on PlayStation 5. As I mentioned earlier, no PC out there will be able to avoid stuttering or slowdown issues in Elden Ring. Even a Core i9 10900K and RTX 3090 could not avoid these issues when the game was running at its absolute lowest settings at 720p. So even an incredibly fast CPU on the game's lowest settings will be plagued by these issues. And on mid-range CPUs, it would be even worse. When using my compromise settings on a Ryzen 3600, we can see that the frame drop that I showed earlier is much more extreme, and the game speed actually even slows down momentarily when this happens. This is not a good showing for Elden Ring. So you may be wondering, is it possible to get around these issues if you have a G-Sync monitor? Well, let's go back to that Vsync off footage I was showing you earlier. Here you can see that there are some sputters above the 16.6 millisecond line that I'm zooming in on here. And as I see it, anything that goes above 22 or 23 milliseconds as a stutter, as a frame time increase, will be visible on a G-Sync monitor. And a lot of the stutters in this game are well in excess of this number, going up to 50, 70, 150, or 250 milliseconds. So VRR on PC will not save the day here. This is not acceptable, and not what I expect from a large game release like this, and it is doubly confounding as the PC versions of From Software games have at least been of acceptable quality since Dark Souls 2 in my opinion. I find these issues large enough to make me disrecommend playing the PC version at the moment. But if you are determined to accept this stuttering because you really want to play the game, then I will have some minor optimized settings and some GPU performance to describe just now. Given how Elden Ring by default does not allow frame rates higher than 60, I set the game to 4K on an RTX 2060 to have frame rates always below 60 no matter what, so I could tell how the settings actually affect GPU performance. When doing so, I found out that the settings in Elden Ring offer up some performance boosts on the GPU, but you have to be willing for the game to start looking a bit worse, a bit more like the PS4 version. For example, there is little performance difference between maximum and high for the grass setting, yet dropping it to medium, like it is found on the last gen consoles, improves performance by 6% in this scene. Same with volumetric quality. I was not able to measure a difference between maximum and high, but going to the noticeably worse looking medium setting saw a measurable 3% performance difference. Same with SSAO, where I could not measure any difference between maximum and high again, yet medium looking noticeably worse runs 3% better. Much the same with screen space reflections, where the low setting ran 3% better. Other settings that I examined show no GPU-related performance cost really on the RTX 2060, but instead seem to be focused on lowering the amount of memory used, such as global illumination setting or the shadow map quality setting. But honestly, on PC, I don't find the amount of memory used on the GPU that big of a deal, as the game is only a bit above 4 GB at 4K. All in all, my recommendations are as follows. If you have a GPU of GTX 1080 power level or higher, I would just consider using the maximum settings and regulating the game's performance with resolution. If you have a GTX 1070 or older AMD GPU like an RX 580 or below, I recommend using the medium settings of the game, but with high shadows, as the medium shadows are of unacceptable quality. With these compromised settings over maximum, I was able to measure a rather good 22% performance increase in this scene, for example, on the RTX 2060 at 1440p, albeit with obvious visual quality loss in shadows and a complete lack of tall grass. With that same scene on the GTX 1060, I was able to measure a 28% performance increase at 1440p. So these settings can help if you're GPU limited, but you will have to accept some compromises. Checking out these settings on the GTX 1060 and RX 580 with the latest drivers at 1080p, I can handedly say that both GPUs are actually not good enough for 60 FPS here, with both having dips below 60 in the overworld when running around due to GPU limitations. While saying that, the GTX 1060 did manage to run a bit better with a 5% higher average frame rate and less stutters, while both were using fresh driver installs. Both of these GPUs though would probably have to drop to 900p, I imagine, to have a more consistent 60 FPS experience. But even then, that would not be actually a consistent 60 FPS experience anyway, due to the stuttering issues which have nothing to do with GPU horsepower. And with that, there's not much more I can reasonably say given this game's current state. At the end, I am confounded that Elden Ring was released given the myriad of issues that it has. I didn't even talk about how the game does not support ultra-wide monitors, and instead puts up black bars in the areas that should be rendering the higher FOV. With blatant issues like that, the incessant stutter, the poor settings, and the lack of higher than 60 FPS, I find this a release that I recommend skipping until many things are fixed. And until then, I hope you liked this video. If you did like it, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support DF on Patreon to get years of our work in high quality for download. Other than that, follow us on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen!